Thank you for joining the University of Findlay tonight for our virtual presentation. Our program will begin shortly. However, I'd like to share a few technical details with all of you. We do want to encourage you to ask questions for our panelists tonight, and you can do so by using the Zoom Q&A icon at the bottom center of your screen. We promise we're going to answer questions at the end, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible, so please keep those coming. We're also going to throw out a few trivia questions throughout the evening tonight, and you can post your answers by using the same Zoom Q&A icon in the bottom center of your screen. Please stand by. Our webinar will begin at 7:30. Good evening. My name is Karen George, and I'm with the University of Findlay, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the university's virtual celebration of the centennial of the 19th Amendment. This is going to be an interactive program, so we hope that you will post your questions using the Zoom Q&A icon, and we're going to throw out a few questions that you can answer using that same icon. And I'll start with the first one. Susan B. Anthony was a very major, prominent figure and force as part of the suffrage movement. So our question is, do you know how many speeches Susan B. Anthony gave on an annual basis? So you think about that, you can use your Q&A to answer. And now I'm going to introduce our host for tonight's program, Dr. Marcia Sloan Latta. Dr. Latta serves as the Vice President of University Advancement here on campus. And this event was her brainchild, and it's been a wonderful collaboration between the university partners and our community. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Latta.
Thank you so much, Karen. And yes, indeed, it is my privilege to be here tonight with all of you. I know we have people joining us from a number of different states and a number of different parts around Ohio. And you are all supporters of the University of Findlay, and we are so appreciative of your support. There's something so terrific about a university in that we have a continued quest for knowledge. And you'll see some of that this evening because we very much have an interdisciplinary program planned for you here this evening. We're delighted and pleased to have Dan Chudzinski, who serves as director of the curatorial aspect of the museum. He is our curator of the Mazza Museum, and he's going to go over some original artwork we have here at the museum that comes from children's books about the 19th Amendment and the women's suffrage movement. We also have Dr. Sara Fedorka, who serves as associate professor and chair of the English department. We have Dr. Rick States, Dean of the College of Health Professions, and he'll be sharing with you a little bit about the Spanish flu, which was happening at the same time as the suffrage movement. And we have with us Kathy Dowd, who serves as curator at the Maumee Valley Historical Society, which houses the Wolcott House. And Kathy is a garment specialist, and she is going to be talking a little bit about how the women's clothing of the suffrage movement ended up shaping women's fashions for years to come. And as you heard, Karen's going to do some great trivia in between. So to set the stage for tonight, as we celebrate the momentous occasion, the centennial celebration this summer of the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which gave women in the United States the right to vote. I'm going to tell you a little bit about what was happening in our country and the world leading up to this. Now, first off, some of you may remember, now wait a minute, didn't we celebrate this last summer? Well, what you're thinking of is last summer, we did have a celebration in Ohio for the ratification of when Ohio ratified the 19th Amendment on June 16th of 1919. The 19th Amendment Actually, there had been an amendment first introduced in Congress, and I believe it was 1878, to give women the right to vote. And there was a movement starting actually during the time of the Civil War leading up to this. And so Congress after Congress, it would be introduced and, you know, it wouldn't pass. But June 4th, 1919, so 101 years ago this evening, the 19th Amendment was passed by Congress, and then it needed to be ratified by 3/4 of the states. And as I mentioned, a year ago on June 16th, Ohio ratified it, and August 18th, 1920 is when Tennessee became the 36th state to approve and ratify it, and that's when then it became part of the Constitution, and women had the right to vote. So a brief overview of what was happening in the country and the world leading up to this. World War I started in 1914, went from 1914 through 1918. And the US joined in World War I in 1917. Now, General Pershing knew there was going to be quite a shortage of young men to fight in this war. And his wife actually suggested to him, well, you know, you are missing half the population out there. And he decided, because women had been nurses before, but they had never been allowed to hold other roles, to be viewed as soldiers, to be trained, and to be enlistees. And he decided, okay, they can be our telephone operators, our stenographers, some were even trained as mechanics. Many were stateside, but there were many that went to Europe as well. And one of the main reasons that had always been given for individuals who did not want to see women have the right to vote was, well, you know, they don't enlist in the military. So why should they have the right to vote? Well, all of a sudden, that reason was taken away because about 12,000 young women actually did enlist in World War I. With the war came food shortages, tremendous meat shortages. Does this sound familiar? And with meatless and wheatless days that were encouraged, then the population started looking for other ways of getting protein. There had been something called peanut butter that was popular in the South, generally was viewed as kind of a delicacy, and had actually been introduced then at the World's Fair to other folks. Well, peanut butter started taking off as a protein option. Likewise, canned tuna. The first commercial cannery opened in 1912. People had been canning and preserving in their homes a variety of fruits and some meat, some other things, but with a commercial cannery, all of a sudden, all kinds of canned goods were becoming popular, and canned tuna was introduced to the population and became quite popular. Tofu was introduced and was not a big success, and didn't really become a popular item for another 55, 60 years in the United States. But that's when it was introduced to the US. Also processed cheese. And in fact, a number of food items that today are viewed as they were introduced and actually kind of started some of our decline from eating habits were actually introduced during this time period of roughly 1910 to 1920. So it's pretty interesting on this. I mentioned the Spanish flu, and Dr. States is going to tell us more about just how incredibly severe that was going through this same time, and really starting in 1918, and it really didn't end until about 1920. It was a presidential election year. Woodrow Wilson was the current president. And one of our trivia questions, and Karen will have the answer for you when we go back to Karen, who won the election of 1920? So, was the United States the first country for women to get the vote? Absolutely not. But again, World War I and having women be enlisted and doing a variety of roles made a tremendous difference in a number of countries. In 1917, in Canada, women got the right to vote. Britain, Germany, and Poland followed in 1918. Austria and the Netherlands in 1919. So you can see the table was being set, the whole plateau. So the population of the United States, so you know, was about 106 million at that time, roughly 1/3 of today. I think today we're at about 325 million, so roughly 1/3. Population of Ohio, 5.8 million, which is about half of what it is today. And the population of Findlay, Ohio, 17,000. And today, I think we're bumping right up on 42,000. So that gives you a little bit of idea in terms of what all was happening. Some other foods, I mentioned peanut butter, and I know we sent out a recipe. And the reason we did that was because many of the suffragettes were being viewed as not womanly, and that if we gave them the right to vote, maybe they wouldn't spend so much time at home. And so some of the suffragettes said, you know, it would be a terrific way for us to raise money and also prove our culinary skills if we sold cookbooks. And so that is how they financed part of the movement. And so there were a number of suffragette cookbooks out on the market. And the recipe that I forwarded to you for gingerbread was from the Women's Suffrage Cookbook, was the name of it. Some other things, stew. Lots of types of stew was popular. Potato soup, cornbread, mentioned canned goods. Jell-O was introduced just a few years earlier, and that was really quite all the rage, as were oatmeal cookies, which again didn't require wheat, and there had been such a wheat shortage. So I thought you would enjoy hearing some of that. Some companies that were introduced about 1910, 1912, 1908. National Biscuit Company, still around today. We know it as Nabisco. Campbell's Soup, Dole, Jell-O, Coca-Cola. Also in 1920, in January of 1920, Prohibition passed, which was why the food suggested and beverages suggested to you included Coca-Cola and lemonade, because unless you were going to a speakeasy, you weren't getting anything stronger than that at that time. Also happening within the world, tremendous immigration movement that had started around 1900 or so, and in 1908, 1910, 1912, a lot of Southern Europeans coming to this country. In fact, the very first pizzeria in the entire nation was opened in New York City in 1910. So a lot of different cultures blending at that time too. With World War I came a very severe economic depression, including food rationing and lots and lots and lots of folks out of work. So that sets the table, the plateau for this evening. And Karen, you have any answers you want to give before we introduce Dr. Fedorka?
Oh, I got to tell you, our audience has been very active, and I was enjoying listening to your commentary. Many people got the answer right, that Harding was actually elected president in 1920, and he was from Ohio. So that's wonderful and exciting. And then I also wanted to, I've also gotten some answers on the question about Susan B. Anthony. So we've had guesses. Somebody guessed 150, somebody guessed 100, somebody gave me a range of 75 to 100, and 75 was the right answer. Susan B. Anthony gave an average of 75 speeches a year for 45 years. So that's dedication. So we're having a great interaction with our audience tonight. And thanks for your question, and I'll let you introduce our first speaker.
Okay, and our first speaker is Dan Chudzinski, who serves as curator of the Mazza Museum, and he is going to take you through a number of pieces of art that actually have been exhibited pre-COVID, and they're just quietly waiting there until such point that the museum at some point will be back open again. So without further ado, Dan, take it away.
Thank you, Marcia. Good evening, and thank you for joining us tonight. Unfortunately, we can't be in the museum, so we're going to do the next best thing and bring the art to you. I will be sharing my screen here momentarily and walking you through each piece. I do want to preface this by saying that the pieces that you are seeing, this is the very first time that they have all been displayed together at the museum because we acquired them specifically for this exhibit. So it's exciting for us to be able to share those with you. And I do also want to remind you that when we're looking at illustrations as opposed to fine art, these were designed specifically to go to accompany the text of a book, a picture book specifically in this case. You will notice that some pages do have large blank white areas. That's usually where the text was set to go. And bear in mind that this is often the first exposure that young learners or children in most cases are learning about something, and in this case it's the suffragette movement. So that's quite the responsibility for our illustrators. So without further ado, I'm going to jump into our gallery here and share my screen, and we'll walk you through each piece. Okay, and I'm gonna start with the very first image that you would have seen, which was on our invitation to the event. So this picture is done by Cheryl Harness, and Cheryl is an author illustrator from the Missouri area. She created the book Rabble Rousers, 20 Women Who Made a Difference. Now, as I'm going through these, I deliberately chose this format so that you can follow along with the name of our illustrator here, who in this case is the author illustrator, and the title of the book as well. The reason that I mention this now is at the end I will be sharing information for how you can get purchase these books through our Mazza gift shop if you are interested. So Cheryl Harness is an artist who is known as one of the foremost illustrators of American history, specifically American historical nonfiction. And so she is the artist that is often commissioned by places like National Geographic and Smithsonian to tell books or to create books about biographies of presidents and famous American historical figures. In this case, she is telling us the story of these 20 women who made a difference in American history. What we are looking at is a watercolor illustration, which is Cheryl's trademark. She is known for her meticulous detail and historical accuracy, so you can bet that all of these signs that we are seeing throughout the composition are based off of something that she has actually researched, as well as the clothing that we're seeing and the automobiles. Now, one thing about Cheryl's style, she is known to paint at times with a brush that consists of a single hair, and she paints a postage stamp area at a time in order to capture that level of detail that she needs. Now, when an illustrator is putting together something this complex, one of the issues is the focal point. Where do you want to draw the attention of this reader? And in this case, Cheryl has chosen to put us right in the middle of this parade. She's drawing our attention to the date by using a color yellow, one of the primary colors that stands out amongst everything else in the composition. And then you'll notice that she has composed a series of diagonals using the flagpoles to guide our view throughout the composition. Now we're going to see that this is one of the most complex illustrations in the entire lineup tonight. We're going to move on to our next one here, which is deliberately second so that you see that contrast. So this work is from the book Bold and Brave, Heroes Who Won Women the Right to Vote by Myra Kalman. And Myra is a Manhattan-based illustrator. She's actually an Israeli-born American illustrator and writer, and she's a frequent contributor to the New York Times and the New Yorker. This is her classic style. She's created this work in gouache, and we'll notice that compared to the earlier work that we looked at by Cheryl Harness, what we're seeing here is what I call the economy of design, or the economy of line. She's showing us the bare minimum required to draw our attention to what she wants us to see. And in that case, the first thing that our eyes is really drawn to is this sign, as well as our two suffragettes, who in the book are not named. These would just be women that were part of a particular parade. Okay, moving on. Our next piece is done by Matt Faulkner for the book Elizabeth Started All the Trouble. And this is a mixed media piece, and Elizabeth that the title is referring to is Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who we're going to be hearing more about tonight. So I will give you a little bit of a summary. She was one of the key figures of the suffragette movement. She was battling to increase the role that women played in American society. And her big moment comes at the Seneca Falls Convention, which happened in July of 1848, where she performed a speech called the Declaration of Sentiments. And this is really what initiated the women's rights movement in the United States. She would join with Susan B. Anthony to lead the movement for almost half a century, but she would die in 1902, never really seeing the true results of her work. What we're seeing here is a scene that actually took place after her death in January of 1917. The National Women's Party decided to picket the White House 6 days a week for 8 hours a day. And they were referred to by various senators and members of the press as the Silent Sentinels, or the Iron-Jawed Angels. Now in June of that year, the women were attacked by a group of young soldiers who believed that their protests were unpatriotic. The women were the ones that were arrested, and the reason given was that they were obstructing traffic. This ultimately led to Alice Paul doing a hunger strike, and the women having to endure forced feedings, which drew national attention. And it ultimately forced Woodrow Wilson to act. Now, when we're looking at this composition, we see that Matt has done something very interesting here. He has put us in the lower portion in the foreground in that protest. So we're seeing actual signs that were used at the time, and then he has used the White House as a prop to stand in place here of the Resolute Desk. And just an interesting side note about the Resolute Desk, it was an Ohio president, Rutherford B. Hayes, who was the very first US president to sit at the Resolute Desk. Okay, moving to our next image from the same book. Now, typically, when I am matting or framing something for the museum, I will crop off the part of the illustration that you do not see in the book, unless there's something there that is of note. And in this case, we see that Matt Faulkner has created a portrait in the book which shows women across history joining together for women's rights. And in this particular case, he has rendered 22 portraits of famous historical figures that were active within the movement. I can point out a few of them here. We have Elizabeth Cady Stanton is right here. Eleanor Roosevelt, you'll see here. Hillary Clinton here. And then we have Sojourner Truth right here, and of Susan B. Anthony. Now this one is kind of a dream piece to get for a piece like this. We're always looking for something for the collection that that really captures the essence of the book, and we'd be hard pressed to find two better illustrations than the two I just showed you for this particular book. Moving into our next book, this is done by illustrator Pamela Johnson. It's a watercolor composition, and you are looking at the cover for the book, If You Lived When Women Won Their Right to Vote. Pamela, when she's discussing this book, the introduction begins with, there was a time in America when girls and women could not wear pants, play sports on a team, ride a bike, or even go to college. If bearing that mentality in mind, what we're seeing is that Pamela is trying deliberately to put us in the role that women were playing during that point of history. She's doing that visually here in the cover by placing us at ground level, walking alongside our protesters during a suffragette parade. And we're going to see from this scene, which again, I had mentioned, when you see a large bare white area on one of our paintings, it usually means that's where text goes. This one I chose specifically to show you how closely she is following the historical record. So I'm going to jump back and forth between two images here. This is the image. I have not consulted Pamela on this, but I believe this is the exact image that she was using. I will draw your attention to the crowd here. We're going to see that the horse cart makes another appearance, as well as certain guards that are standing. You will notice that she's going to add a few figures in the foreground to help with her narrative. So we see that here. We see that the boy and the woman that is appearing with almost angelic wings was added to the composition, as well as these members of the crowd that are interacting. We have men here who are actually stomping out one of the signs. And so when we look at something like this, we're not looking at Pamela necessarily as a revisionist historian, but she is trying to tell as much of the narrative as possible using the information that is readily available to her. Okay, our next illustration is by Rebecca Gibbon, and this is from the book Elizabeth Leads the Way. And this is the cover. This is also very similar to an illustration that we are seeing on page 24 of the book. Really, the only difference is the expression on Elizabeth's face. This one really lends itself nicely to the next illustration from the book, and I'm going to draw your attention to this area of the map. This is Seneca Falls. Seneca Falls, again, is where Elizabeth gave her speech that really launched the women's rights movement. And then what Rebecca is doing is using the map to show us that how this spread throughout the nation. Okay, and our final book that we're going to be looking at illustrations from is the book The Fight of the Century by Sara Greene. This is a digital composition, so the next two pieces you're going to see were created exclusively on the computer. And when you look at this one, it probably appears at first as an unfinished illustration. The reason for that is it is an unfinished illustration. This is a preliminary cover version. You can see that she's handwriting the text and the notes, and she's trying to lay out what we call a value study. So she's composing the basic elements, probably showing this to her editor before she commits to more detail, which we'll see here in the final version of the cover. Now, we notice that our two contenders in the fight of the century are Woodrow Wilson and, in this case, Alice Paul. And we see that our illustrator, Sara Greene, has chosen that title very deliberately. It was inspired, and actually the book is presented as a 4-round boxing match. And so Sara Greene was looking at actual boxing posters from the era, as well as Jazz Age lithographs that were being done. And she's trying to give the entire book that feel, and also to do the excitement level justice that was happening during this. So I'm not going to get into too much of the details of Alice Paul, but each round of the fight represents a certain stage in her fight for women's rights.
So Dan, thank you so very, very much. We really appreciate this. And as he mentioned, the pictures are up in the gallery, And of course, the museum right now is closed, but at the point that we're able to be back there, we do hope you'll come see it. And as he also mentioned, we have several books that are available for purchase through the gift shop when that is open. So thank you so very, very much. And our next speaker is Dr. Sara Fedorka. And Dr. Fedorka is the Associate Professor and Chair of the English Department, and her presentation will consider how the suffragettes represented themselves in language. So, Sara?
Thank you very much, Marcia. Welcome, and it is my pleasure to join you this evening. I am also going to share my screen with you, and while I am doing this, I'm going to invite you to think about the image that Dan just showed us from Matt Faulkner's book. Elizabeth started all the trouble, where if you had noticed off to the side or kind of to one side, there was a woman holding a placard, and her sign said, "Remember the ladies." And that is a reference to Abigail Adams, who in what is now a famous letter to her husband, written in March of 1776, she encouraged John to remember the ladies while he was off in Philadelphia, helping to draft the Declaration of Independence and composing the grievances that were laid before the tyrant King George as the colonists were asserting their rights. And what I would like you to notice, so what you see on the left-hand side is the actual, a photo facsimile of the image of her handwriting. She says about 3 lines down from the top is where "Remember the Ladies" begins. And what I'd call you to notice in the typed transcription of the letter to the side, beyond the spelling was not standardized at this time, so you'll see what looks like typos, but would have been the familiar spellings at the time. You'll notice where she says men could be tyrants, would be tyrants if they could. If particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion and will not hold to having ourselves represented by laws without representation. So this should sound familiar to you because it is the language that you might recognize that the colonists themselves were using as they were arguing against taxation in particular without representation, and the notion that these men and women, but men in particular, did not have a voice as the British were enforcing laws on the colonies. And so the idea was to lay the grievances before the king. So I invite you to think all the way back to 1776, because I want to be able, as Marcia suggested, to provide some context to help us to understand how these women were making the argument they were making for their rights. As Dan demonstrated, one of the ways that we understand moments of history is through visual representation, through images and photographs, through paintings. What I'm going to invite us to consider is also the language that is used to represent particular moments in history. And this is language that I'll be showing you that was used both for those, by those in favor of women's suffrage, and also by those who would have been the anti-suffragettes, those who were against women's right to vote. And those against women's right to vote weren't just men. Women were also against the idea that women should vote, in part for the reason that Marcia mentioned in her introduction. It was the notion that somehow if you were given the right to vote as a woman, it would make you less womanly. So part of what we're going to look at right now is this idea of what is a lady, what is a woman, and what does voting have to do with any of this? So as Dan mentioned, the Seneca Falls Convention occurred in 1848, and in 1850, there was a women's rights convention that was happening in Massachusetts. What you see here on the screen is an excerpt from a response to that convention. And it is a negative response. The writer of this was not in favor of women's rights in any way. And please understand too that when we talk about women's rights or equality for women or Abigail Adams asking her husband to remember the ladies, we are not necessarily thinking about equal rights for women as we might think of them today. There was a far more limited understanding of what rights for women would have meant. So what I have circled and what I call your attention to here is where we begin to see the language of what Marcia mentioned, this idea of true womanhood. The idea that women are by nature different from men and that their nature consigns them to the domestic sphere, that their role is in the home. Their job is to bring moral and ethical awareness into the home and to leave the dirty business of business and politics outside the home to men. So the language here, I think, is worth noting. Within the circle, you'll see where it says, to everything that has an effect to ennoble and dignify womanhood, to make the woman truly the companion of the man and not his mere toy or housekeeper, we are prepared to say Godspeed. But we do not believe the true dignity of womanhood can ever be attained by woman's habitually unsexing herself. So part of what you start to see happening here is this notion that if women are enter into the foray of what would have been considered a man's world or out of the domestic sphere, they would be literally stripping themselves of their womanliness. They would be unsexing themselves, and they would have in fact been putting on manly behaviors or manly virtues, and then might come to be more manly in their behavior and understanding, which of course threatens their ability to manage the home, right? As Marcia was saying, much of what was happening at the time involved, feeding and caring for your family. And so the notion that by giving women equal rights or the right to vote, in some way that jeopardizes their ability to manage the household. So we see this as early as 1850. I'm going to show you now, this is from 1872, and it is Thoughts on Female Suffrage, and it is in favor of female suffrage. This author is writing that she believes that female suffrage will benefit women. Interestingly, she is still making her argument within the frame or the confines of the idea of what is true womanhood. So noting at the beginning here, she is commenting that she's often wanted to write in response to some of what she reads in the women's department of this Maine Farmer magazine. Presumably the rest of the magazine was for men, the women they got their department. So when she reads the question of an invitation to discuss the right of suffrage, she says out loud to herself, and I'm quoting from the first paragraph, "I believe I must have a finger in that pie." She then says her husband responds to her that she had better put her finger in pies at home. To which she replies, "I asked him if I did not make him all the pies and other good things he ought to eat, and he answered, 'Oh, yes.'" So here then is her response. "So I think I have proved that I attend to the first right and privilege of every true woman by making my home comfortable, and yet I have a little time to talk and read and write about other matters." So here you see this author is making the argument that I can still be a true woman. I can still manage what is mine rightfully, what is my responsibility, my home, take care of my husband and my children. And I can still also have time to think and talk and write about issues like women's suffrage. I'm going to pause here to say that true womanhood was a very specifically race and classed idea of what women were and what they should be. And it was predominantly geared towards white, middle, and upper middle class women. When we talk about true womanhood, that's kind of what you should be picturing. You saw it in the illustrations where it is predominantly white women walking in white on the street. These women would also have been in a traditional heterosexual marriage, and the goal was to have boy children, because as she goes on to say, the benefit, yes, will be to women, but in the sense that they will broaden their mind, and that will allow them to be better mothers. In fact, they will then be able to have conversations, this is from the second paragraph, with their children at home, discussions about things that young boys in particular might have gone to taverns or other unseemly places to learn about from irreputable people. So now the woman is saying, if you give me the right to vote, I will be able to have a better understanding of the world, and that will help me better do my job as a mother. So same argument or same kind of representation of what a woman is, but a different argument about how it relates to women's suffrage. Now here's an illustration that is an anti-suffrage illustration. We're now in 1909, and I'm just trying to show you the trajectory of these arguments rooted in what a woman should be. Here you have a rather masculinized woman heading literally out the door. She is turning her back on her family. You see a rather feminized man holding 2 crying babies. The tea kettle is whistling on the stove. There is a broken plate on the floor. The bread still needs to be sliced. Presumably breakfast either hasn't been served or the dishes have not been put away. The woman, however, is not interested in managing these, which are her rightful responsibilities. She is more interested that it is election day. You will notice the sign for women's votes on the wall above her head. And what you can see very slightly in the bottom is an actual ballot where it shows that she is going to elect into office women in all of the positions that are to be voted on that day. The danger the anti-suffragettes are saying is that it leaves the man incapable and at home, which is not his place. Now, again, you see this same argument being made, but now it's being used by the suffragettes. Rose O'Neill, who was the originator of the CUPE, supported women's rights. So now we are still in the early 20th century, and CUPE is supporting votes for women. And what CUPE is saying there at the bottom is, our food, our health, our home, our schools, our play are all regulated by men's votes. Isn't it a funny thing when father cannot see why mother ought to have a vote on how these things should be? So again, the idea is that women's place is in the home, but that by giving women the right to vote, they will be able to make better decisions and have influence on issues that are home issues, right? CUPE is not arguing that women should have the right to vote so they understand world politics. They should have the right to vote so that they can participate in local elections about home issues. And then our last CUPE to bring us full circle is the crying CUPE, who says, I am a girl baby and I am going to be taxed without representation. So part of what was being argued here is the same argument that Abigail Adams made in 1776, only now we are in the early 20th century, and this notion that women don't have a voice and that the government doesn't hear them. And what I hope I have demonstrated for you here is that this argument for or against voting was built up in ideas at the time about what it meant to be a woman. Thank you.
You absolutely did, Dr. Frederica. Thank you so much for sharing so much of your knowledge. And on the theme of women, there were many women who were on the forefront of this movement. So our next trivia question, it's an Ohio question. In what Ohio city did Sojourner Truth, Dan mentioned her in the artwork, in what city did she give her famous speech that ended with the famous quote, and ain't I a woman? So you think about that. You can post it in the Q&A. Also ask us questions, which we're going to answer at the end. Dr. Latta, who's our next speaker?
Our next speaker is Dr. Rick States, and Dr. States serves as Dean of the College of Health Professions here at the University of Findlay, and he's going to talk with us a little bit about the terrible pandemic of the Spanish flu and some of its influences and terrible effects at that time period, and perhaps any correlations or parallels that he may see to today's COVID disease. So Dr. States?
So it's been 100 years since we passed the 19th Amendment, but this year was supposed to be a year of celebration and commemoration, but then COVID hit. Centennial plans ground to a halt, events were scrapped, and an extraordinary era of social distancing was ushered in. But keep in mind, this is not something new. The Spanish flu also occurred when women's suffrage was passed in 1918 and complicated the plans for the women trying to get suffrage passed. Suffragists themselves found making their case amid the panic of a pandemic where illness was everywhere, gatherings were banned, and canceled plans became the norm, kind of like today. According to the World Economic COVID Action Platform, women comprise the majority of health and social care workers and are on the front lines of the fight against COVID-19. Mass school closures have particularly affected women because they still bear much of the responsibility of childcare. Women already do 3 times as much unpaid care work when compared to men, and caring for relatives with virus only adds to this burden. According to the International Labor Organization, globally, women perform 76.2% of the total hours of unpaid care work, which is more than 3 times as much as men. In Asia and the Pacific countries, this figure rises to closer to 80%. As health systems become stretched, many people with COVID-19 will need to be cared for at home, adding to the overall burden, as well as putting a greater risk of becoming infected. Nearly 300 million students globally are currently missing class due to a virus-led school closures, and that's according to the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization. This mass shutdown of child care centers and schools across the world has left many working parents with little choice but to take time off or to try and work from home while caring for their children. The New York Times reports that the closing of the schools hits women particularly hard because much of this responsibility for child care still falls on them. Those who are poor, working in service jobs cannot be done from home. These people also have problems because they may not have paid leave. Another unintended consequence of school closures is the strain on health systems because many of our medical professionals are struggling to find child care. The impact of the pandemic on women's rights. The suffrage movement itself was threatened and had big influences by the Spanish flu. One little tidbit that I want to point out, though, is when we talk about the Spanish flu, it most likely originated in the United States. How did it gain its name Spanish flu? Well, it's because at the time, Spain was not involved in the World Wars and in the First World War, and therefore had a little more truthful data that was coming out. So the other countries were at war, so they didn't want to expose their truth. So they had the most accurate data. But it should be noted that we think that the first case was actually found in the United States. It was recorded on March 11th, 1918 at Fort Riley in Kansas. This worker shortage caused by the flu and World War I opened access to the labor market for women in unprecedented numbers. They took jobs outside the home. Following the conclusion of the war, the number of women in the workforce was 25% higher than it had been previously. And by 1920, women made up 21% of all gainfully employed individuals in the country. While this gender boost is often ascribed to World War I alone, a woman's increased presence in the workforce would not have been as pronounced without the 1918 Spanish flu. While this virus disproportionately affected young men, women stepped into the public roles that had not previously been open to them. More women than men were left standing after the war and the pandemic. 100 years ago, this powerful strain of the flu swept the globe, infecting 1/3 of the world's population. The aftermath of this disaster, too, led to an unexpected social changes, opening up new opportunities for women, in the process irreversibly transforming the life of everyone in the United States. Again, the virus affected men more than the women, created a shortage of labor. This gap enabled women to play a new and indispensable role in the workforce during this crucial period, just before the ratification of the 19th Amendment, which granted women's suffrage in the United States 2 years later. I was going to make some kind of crack and try and be funny and talk about why it affects men more than women, because men, sometimes we don't have, when we get sick, we turn into a little bit maybe of a baby. So I won't go there because I was afraid that would offend someone. So just pretend I didn't say that. Exact reason why men tend to be more vulnerable to the flu than women is actually eluding researchers. The scoffing modern term man flu refers to the perception that men are overly dramatic when they fall ill, but recent research suggests that there may be more to it than just exaggerated symptoms. Known as the Spanish flu, the 1918 Great Influenza left more than 50 million people dead, including around 670,000 in the United States. To put that in perspective, World War I, which concluded just as the flu was at its worst in November of 18, killed around 17 million people, a mere third of the fatalities caused by the flu. More American soldiers died from the flu than were killed in battle. The war provided near perfect conditions for the spread of the flu virus via the respiratory droplets exhaled by infected individuals. Military personnel, predominantly young males, spent most months in close quarters with thousands of other troops. This proximity, combined with the stress of war, the malnutrition at the time, created weakened immune systems in soldiers and allowed the virus to spread like wildfire. When soldiers shipped out, influenza went right along with them. Overcrowding in training camps, trenches, hospitals created such an ideal environment for the flu to infect high numbers of people. In fact, the conditions of the war helped the virus perfect itself through several waves of infection, and much more deadly than the last. I'm not a fearmonger, but we do have to take this into account as well. We do think that COVID-19 will see another spike coming in the fall or possibly in the spring. Again, these waves of infections could be quite serious. Many troops were doomed before they even reached Europe, contracting the flu on the packed troop ships where a single infected soldier could spread the virus throughout. When soldiers returned to the United States, they scattered to every state, bringing the flu along with them. It is more than just male conscription to war, however, that led to a greater number of men who were infected and died from flu. Even at home, among those that were never involved in the war effort, the death rate for men exceeded that of women. Demographic studies show that nearly 175,000 more men died than women in 1918. In general, epidemics tend to kill more men than women. In disease outbreaks throughout history, as well as almost all of the world's major famines, women have a longer life expectancy than men and often have a greater survival rate. I tried to include some examples, and I just wanted to point some of the comparisons there. We don't have all the data, of course, for COVID-19, but we can say that there are some striking similarities. Hopefully we won't have waves. Hopefully we will have a vaccine. Hopefully we become immune, but these are risks that we are involved with. A century later, as the coronavirus pandemic brings America to a standstill again, just as the country was gearing up for celebrations to mark the Amendment Centennial, the suffrages near miss provides us with extremely valuable lessons. Thank you, folks.
Thank you so much, Dr. States. And those are some pretty sobering statistics and thoughts of those troops. And again, some interesting parallels and interesting differences. So thank you so very, very much. With respect to the answer to the trivia question in terms of where did Sojourner Truth speak in Ohio, two people answered correctly. It was in Akron, Ohio. So another Ohio claim to fame. So at this time, I would like to introduce our final presenter for the evening, and then we will entertain a few questions. Kathy Dowd serves as curator at the Maumee Valley Historical Society, and she is dressed as a suffragette this evening in a reproduction clothing attire, and she has some interesting insights to share with us. So please join me in welcoming Kathy Dowd.
Thank you, Marcia. First, I would like to thank the University of Findlay for inviting me to participate in this wonderful centennial celebration of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. My topic tonight will be the apparel of the iconic suffragette and the carefully crafted message that it was designed to convey. So relax as I take you back 100 years to take a closer look at the women's suffrage movement and how their apparel and dress define their message and mission for all time. What we wear says a lot about our personalities, our beliefs, sometimes even our politics. No one knew this better than the brave women of the suffrage movement in the early 20th century. They were dubbed suffragettes by the Daily Mail, one of the most influential newspapers of the day. And at the time, it was intended to be a derogatory term, but they embraced it, which was a very cool thing to do. The movement was spearheaded by Emmeline Pankhurst. You may recognize her name from the opening song in the iconic movie Mary Poppins, starring Julie Andrews. In the scene, Mrs. Banks bursts through the front door in full suffragette regalia singing "Soldiers in Petticoats." She exclaims, "Take heart, Mrs. Pankhurst's been clamped in irons again." Emmeline Pankhurst, one of the pioneers of the suffrage movement, felt that a subtle, low-key approach to gain women's rights, especially the right to vote, would not be effective unless the movement had a unified, all-out, full-force approach, an approach unheard of and quite extreme at the time, especially given the fact that radical behavior and participation in activities such as public protests and hunger strikes by women of all was looked upon as vulgar, highly unacceptable, and unladylike at the time. However, in the end, this unconventional approach to getting their message across worked. Today, the suffrage movement is remembered for its radical, unorthodox tactics, which history has proven was highly effective and did achieve its goal. As the cry for the right to vote spread, the apparel worn by millions of suffragettes came to symbolize their cause. The fine tailored white suit has become iconic and synonymous with the struggle for equal rights in the early 20th century. An outspoken contemporary advocate for women's equality wrote, "Fashion, feminism, and politics has always been heated territory, and the suffragettes knew this. By encouraging supporters to be dainty, neat, and precise in their appearance, the suffragettes proved how powerful what we in the modern age would call brand recognition could be. In response to detractors who labeled women seeking equality as mannish and browbeaters in suits, members of the movement adopted a very specific look and color scheme to convey a cohesive common goal and mission. The specific colors chosen to represent and harness their ideals were green, color of hope, white for innocence and purity, and violet for dignity and loyalty. We have no proof, but it has been speculated that these three colors were very carefully chosen. If you take the first letters of each color, you get G, W, V, which works perfectly with the phrase, "Give women the vote," something to ponder. Ushering in the age of the carefree, unrestricted fashions and trends of the Roaring '20s, the new aesthetic movement, popularized by Oscar Wilde, rallied against all of the restrictive apparel of bygone days. Freedom of movement had a direct correlation with freedom in all respects. Rational dress reform strived to free society from restrictive apparel, including corsets and the impractical hobble skirt, an example of which I am wearing this evening. As you can see, as I try to step forward, the hobble skirt does not allow for easy movement, as far as I can go, let alone for long strides necessary for peaceful protest marches. So in 1910, the official freedom suit was introduced by the American Ladies Tailors Association. Yes, as you can imagine, it caused quite a stir within the previously dominated male profession of tailoring. By 1913, the suffrage movement had gained enough momentum to mount a women's march on Washington, D.C., the country's capital. The perfect protest was comprised of thousands of brave women, and yes, surprisingly, men as well. The Capitol March was the first international event of its kind, with participants from all over the world. Newspapers from all over the globe covered the spectacular event and put the new suffrage movement on the front page of thousands of newspapers around the United States and the globe. A finely tailored white linen suit, similar to the one that I'm wearing tonight, became the iconic image of the strong, confident modern woman. It was recorded in newspapers of the day that the visual impact of thousands of women marching in white, wearing sashes and waving banners of green, purple, and white was a striking scene to behold. The stark contrast of the pure white suffragette marchers to the somber male spectators in their dark gray business suits along the parade routes was often noted when rallies were covered by the press. The colors worn by the marchers in Washington were strategically chosen to convey a very specific message to onlookers. Teachers and students wore green, women journalists and writers wore white, and artists wore violet. The color differentiation was designed intentionally to convey that suffragettes and their supporters were educated, intelligent, talented, and highly skilled citizens who had a lot to contribute to society. They were not a group of rabble-rousers trying to upset the status quo. The 1913 march sparked a flame that spread rapidly and continued to gain momentum until the United States entered World War I. At that point, the suffrage movement was temporarily suspended to concentrate on victory in Europe. An amazing thing happened, however. Following Armistice Day, when the men of America returned home from the Great War, there was no denying that the women of America had stepped up and into thousands of traditional trades and occupations that had been vacated when they left. Whether mechanics, engineers, pilots, miners, aviators, it was the women of the United States that kept the country running during the First World War. America came out of the First World War with its industry and commerce stronger than ever. The enormous sacrifices and contributions of the fairer sex, both on the home front as well as the front, was undeniable. So finally, on August 26, 1920, with the passing of the 19th Amendment, American women were finally granted full voting rights. Soon other nations around the world followed with similar laws and legislation, inspired by America's recognition of women's rights. At long last, the suffragettes had achieved their goal, and women had the right to vote. Huzzah! Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathy. That was
Quite
wonderful.
welcome.
And we sure appreciate you dressing up for us this evening, too, to show us that highly restrictive hobble skirt. I can't imagine how long it must have taken to walk 20 yards in that.
Very slowly.
So this concludes our formal remarks. I know that we have had a few questions, and so I'm going to answer one that showed up here from Judith Kondo, wondering the root of how the term suffragette came about, and Kathy answered part of that. The root of that word suffrage does derive from the Latin term, which means to vote. So that's a Latin root of that word. Karen, do we have other questions?
Well, one question came through, and again, it's for Kathy. And again, you mentioned the restrictive movement, but the question from one of our audience members is, how long does it take you to put on that authentic apparel of the suffrage movement? And maybe another question, if I can, how long does it take you to transition back into your 2020 apparel and for today?
It takes about 45 minutes to get into this, especially if I'm wearing all the correct underpinnings, because at this time in the world, women still were wearing corsets. It wasn't until the flapper period when the young women were able to not adapt to the corset. Women who had been wearing corsets had to wear their corsets throughout their entire life. You can't just wear a corset for 30 years and then stop wearing it. So it would have taken a good 45 minutes to get into your apparel. Getting out is a lot faster. But let me clarify that scene in Pirates of the Caribbean where he just takes a sword, and that she would not be around to tell the story. That is a complete Hollywoodism. It does take a little time to get out of your corset. And one of the main reasons that women did faint from wearing corsets wasn't that they were so restricted wearing them. If you take your corset off too fast, the blood rushes to your head, and that's what tends to help you to, that's why we have fainting couches. So when you do take your corset off, you don't just take it off quickly. You have to, like other things that we wear today that we can't wait to get off when we get home.
Very
yes.
Interesting, and I don't intend to ever learn that. I mean, to experience that. We do have Cheryl Buckland. I see that you have raised your hand. Amy, can you help facilitate her question so that I can hear her? Cheryl, are you able to answer or ask this? Okay, Amy, if you can work with Cheryl so that I can learn what the question is, we will be happy to direct it to the right person. Are there any other questions that have come through here? Karen, do you see any others?
No other question, but I wanted to leave, I want to thank Ann Arbaugh for doing all the research for our trivia questions tonight. And there was one that I want to leave you with a sobering thought. The Seneca Falls Convention that happened in Seneca Falls, New York, that Dan mentioned in 1848, there were about 500 attendees. And of those attendees, do any of you in the audience or our panelists know how many lived to be able to exercise her legal right to vote? And you get bonus points if you know the name of the woman. And it is one woman, just one. Her name was Charlotte Woodard, and she got to vote at the very young age of 91. So very sobering what we've learned about today and the impact on women back then and women now.
Wow. Cheryl Buckland, I just want you to know we are going to follow up with you because, there are technical challenges here, and I think we've just experienced one. So we'll follow up with you to learn what your question is and make sure that it is answered. And at this point, I just want to give a giant round of applause to our panelists who joined us here remotely from various places in their homes, etc. So thank you so very, very much for joining us, for all the time that you put into researching this. And I want to thank all of you who Zoomed in this evening. Also to let you know, we have recorded this, and we do have some folks who couldn't join us this evening who definitely plan to watch the recording, and the recording will be available to you as well. You are all donors to the University of Findlay. We so appreciate your support. So once again, panelists, thank you so much, and I am going to turn it back to Karen George.
All right. Well, I know I certainly learned a lot from our panelists and all the content this evening, and we sure hope that you did as well. The University of Findlay is dedicated to providing lifelong learning for students of all ages and every stage of life, and we do appreciate your support. And if you enjoyed tonight's programming and you want us to continue to do more of these types of events, we're leaving this address on the screen where you can visit and you can make your gift. Thanks so much. We hope you had a great evening. Thanks for being with us.